Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer lore. A bit of a short one today, but a necessary one, where we are going to be talking about Warpstone, that delectable green substance that is so beloved by the fluffy furries of the Warhammer universe. In common parlance, there is two different types of Warpstone. There is Warpstone, and there is Verbstone. However, this is a mistake by the more civilized races of the world. The humans, even some dwarves and some elves, even think that Verbstone and Warpstone are two different things, with Warpstone being the solidified form of chaos, of raw chaotic magic, whereas Verbstone is the solidified form of beneficial magic, the magic known to the elves, the lizardmen, and of course the realms of men. Verbstone has many legends surrounding it, like for example its ability to heal diseases, regrow limbs, and bring great blessings upon the people who own it. And it is an exceedingly valuable substance, traded with illegally and secretively, but in considerable quantities throughout the Empire. And when we're talking about considerable quantities, we are talking about basically weapons-grade poison here, so a considerable quantity of Wordstone would be a few grams. Unfortunately, however, for the filthy furless humans and the other civilized races, this turns out to be a bit of a mistake. Verbstone is just Warpstone by another name, and with another set of legends surrounding it. It is all the solidified matter of chaos, because at the end of the day, all magic stems from chaos, no matter what the High Elves or the priests of the Sigmarite faith might tell you. It's all chaos at the end of the day. But this does not mean that all of the legends are false. Warpstone can indeed cure diseases, regrow limbs, grant great wealth, or fuel magical rituals that might grant these things instead. There is but one teensy-wincy tiny little detail that has been overlooked in the case of the Weirdstone legends. While Warpstone is capable of all of these things and more, it is also more than capable of doing the exact opposite of what you want it to do. In fact, the odds are quite considerably in favor of the second option. You might, for example, want to use a mere sliver of Verbstone to heal a broken limb, but the odds are pretty good that instead of healing the limb, it will simply create a new one. One looking like a fleshy tentacle, for example. And of course, it can be used to fuel all kinds of magics. In fact, the safest way of regenerating a limb would not be to use the Warpstone itself, but rather to use it to fuel the spell. Unfortunately, Warpstone is a somewhat unstable substance, and even being in contact with it, just touching it, is likely to infer upon the person in question interesting consequences. Best case scenario, they will be relatively harmless, like growing another head that constantly whispers dark secrets at you, or developing another set of buttholes in the formation of a satanic star. These would be considered relatively mild things. The worst things might be, for example, instantaneously sprouting mutations all over your body and degenerating into a chaos spawn, or being driven completely and utterly batshit insane and being convinced that worms are burrowing through your flesh. Or, indeed, the Warpstone might simply decide to just place burrowing worms all through your flesh. It might very well do that. And prolonged exposure to Warpstone, oh, that's where stuff gets really interesting. We're talking insanity at the very least, and in all due likelihood a wide and fascinating variety of mutations, both psychological and physical. And the end result of all of this is almost certainly good old-fashioned death, either as a result of rampant mutation, or as a result of the local clergy or any other Puritans that are not too fond of mutations bashing your brains in with a heavy blunt object. Yes, indeed, the usage of Warpstone is dangerous, to put it rather mildly, and for the vast majority of the races in the Warhammer world, handling any quantity, even down to the very grams, for any period of time is heavily discouraged for your own personal safety. There are, however, a few races that have either figured out countermeasures or have simply developed a resistance to it, or simply just doesn't care about the consequences. For example, in the case of the followers of the Dark Gods. As far as they are concerned, chaos mutations are gifts rendered onto them by the gods themselves, and as such, an extra leg or a third penis is no big deal. In fact, it could be considered a gift from the gods, and worthy of a certain status within their society. In the case of the Chaos Dwarves, they are not anywhere near as fond of mutations. Being dwarves, they're also extremely resistant to the mutagenic effects of chaos, and being Chaos Dwarves, who have already suffered their fair share of Warpstone-induced havoc, they have developed a fair bit of resistance to it. Additionally, they're not idiots. As such, they have developed leaden tools and containers to protect them from the worst effects of Warpstone and allow them to work it in a relatively safe manner. Now, it should be noted that the Chaos Dwarves overvalue safety in the humble opinions of this mere Skaven. This limits the effectiveness of the weapons and tools they can create using the Warpstone. They are still fairly dangerous, but they pale in comparison to the glorious machination of the Skaven master race, who give not the faintest of rat farts for the safety of the test subjects on hand. For you see, as with all things, true mastery lies within the delightful Skaven race. They recognize Warpstone for what it is, a gift from the Horned Rat, and they build their entire society upon it. It is one of their premier forms of currency in the form of warp tokens, and even the lowliest Skaven can handle warp tokens with a relative degree of safety, having developed considerable resistances against it. It is even occasionally used in food in very, 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 very minute quantities, and some, particularly insane individuals, might even use it as snuff or as a form of tobacco, which is risky, to put it bluntly. But the more favoured of the Horned Rat servants, amongst them Grace is, can actually do this with, again, relative safety. Everything, again, being rather relative when it comes to Warpstone. And of course, in addition to these noble and virtuous uses, the mighty clan Scryer has also devised a wide variety of usages for Warpstone as a fuel source. They use it to fuel various vehicles, for example, like massive underground trains and huge drills. And yes, it is true that one of these drills almost wiped out the Skaven race when it blew up under Skavenblight, creating a rather large hole in the middle of the capital, but these minor setbacks are insignificant compared to the greater glory of the Skaven race that can be unlocked with the usage of Warpstone. And, of course, Clan Squire is quite fond of weaponizing Warpstone, which is kind of like weaponizing autism combined with anthrax, highly efficient and exceedingly inhumane. For example, the ever-famous Warp Fire Thrower, which essentially fires out a substance kind of like promethium, except instead of oil, it utilizes a skunky, gooey mixture with a tiny bit of warpstone worked into it. If you don't burn to death, then the rampant mutations racking your body, that'll take care of you rather quickly. It's kind of like being exposed to radiation on steroids. Cancer will be the absolute least of your fucking concerns, but it will be one of many, many concerns you will have in the last few seconds of your life. In fact, it would not at all be unreasonable to say that if you do get hit by a warp fire thrower, you'd probably want to die right there and then, because if you do survive, well, you're going to have some interesting problems coming forward, both in societal terms and in just good old-fashioned physical terms. Those 6 buttholes do not wipe themselves, after all. Clan Squire also have some slightly more mundane uses for it. that are far more safe, because of course operating a warp fire thrower is basically suicide in the long term. If the constant exposure to the very fuel you are firing doesn't kill you within the first few months, then you can be damn sure your enemy will the moment they figure out what your weapon does, as you will find yourself very, very popular indeed amongst enemy archers and anyone with a lick of sense and access to a ranged weapon of some sort. These other more mundane uses are, for example, in the form of ammunition, where it is utilized in very, very small quantities to enhance the explosive power of gunpowder, creating overpowered warplock Jeziles. Occasionally, particularly insane Clan Squire individuals will even replace the firing flint on their Jeziles with a small piece of Warpstone, further enhancing the boom of the weapon, occasionally to catastrophic effect. Additionally, they utilize large balls of solid warpstone as ammunition. Now, of course, chunks of warpstone this large are very, very expensive and therefore extremely precious, but anything that gets hit by something like this is not going to be surviving to tell the tale. They also utilize small slivers of warpstone in the magical, the infamous, the genius squeaker, essentially a telephone with a small sliver of warpstone inside of it. If you thought your cell phone was likely to give you cancer, this thing actually guarantees it. It comes with a guarantee literally written on the box: will result in cancer. Use at your own discretion. But on the bright side, it can be used to communicate with other Skavens all across the Under Empire, and after all, you don't have to operate the phone yourself. This is what we have slaves for, after all. But Skryre and the Grey Seers are not the only ones in Skaven society to utilize this fantastically delicious substance. Clan Mulder is also rightfully famed for their mutagenic experiments. Now, of course, good old-fashioned genetics will allow you to do some interesting things to creatures and mutate them to a certain amount, but Warpstone, oh, now you are going to be getting far more interesting results. Now, the art of mutating something with Warpstone is an imprecise art because Warpstone is a finicky substance. Exposing a particular species of a rat to Warpstone in a particular way and a particular amount might result in the relatively stable mutation of a wolf rat, a particularly large and vicious rat, often used for tracking purposes, or it might result in a 7-footed, 6-armed, winged rat bat that flies around the cavern, causing considerable amounts of havoc. If you're particularly unlucky, it might even breathe fire. However, again, these minor and relatively insignificant setbacks will not halt the glorious march of progress of the Skaven race. And over the years, Clan Mulder have discovered several relatively stable strains of mutants, which occasionally can even breed, which saves a great deal of hassle. The giant rats being one of their staple products, along with rat ogres, wolf rats, and various other specialist breeds, like for example particularly large, vicious and corpulent breeders that can produce abnormally large litters before dying violently. Or perhaps large, massive cavern beasts, capable of burrowing through the soft ground of the earth, and even through solid rock on occasion, if suitably, enhanced. Or massive beasts of burden that can carry dozens of tons worth of materials and other precious commodities. But now that we've talked about what uses Warpstone has, let's cover where it actually fucking comes from. Now, obviously, it is the solidified stuff of magic, which means it can occur naturally. Although in almost all circumstances, it will occur in very, 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 very minute quantities, to the point of relatively harmless amounts. Basically, the Warhammer world is practically covered in microscopic warpstone particles. However, they exist in such minute quantities that they will not have a severe effect upon most humans. Now, of course, you could be unlucky and live in a hotspot, and such hotspots often experience unfortunate rates of, special babies, shall we say, and other unfortunate mutations amongst offspring, both bovine in nature and human. And quite frequently an interesting mix of the two, usually referred to as beast men, although not of the pure kind. These would be the ungors. However, the primary sources of Warpstone are those produced after the collapse of the Northern Gate, the Northern Warp Gate. This sent considerable amounts of the stuff flying throughout the entire Warhammer world, and have deposited themselves in larger or smaller quantities. For example, you might find a tiny little Warpstone rock just out in the wilds, or in a mountain peak, or even massive deposits that have been flung thousands of kilometers at the collapse of the gates to embed themselves deep into mountains. The Skaven stronghold of Crippled Peak is one such example. Now, Crippled Peak was briefly and unjustly occupied by the filthy, dirty traitor to Skaven kin, Nagash, who abused the goodwill and trusting nature of Skavendom to give them mere trinkets, tiny amounts of Warpstone in return for slaves and other valuable resources. But once the great, glorious and just masters of Skavendom realized that Nagash was tricking them and keeping a vast treasure trove of Warpstone for himself, they initiated a correct response, and had him brutally assassinated by an Araby prince. Because it was the right thing to do, damn it. And then, now that Cripple Peak found itself without a leader, the poor, delicate, and just Skaven took it upon themselves to maintain the fortress at Cripple Peak and make sure that all of that Warpstone didn't go to waste. But there is, of course, also one other source of Warpstone, a rather, considerable one, namely the moon. The moon, as it happens, is not made out of cheese, but it is made out of something that rats do indeed covet, namely Warpstone. Because, of course, the Warhammer world has two moons. One is known as the Chaos Moon, Morslib, and that's the one that's made out of solid chaos matter. And true to its name, it has some rather interesting effects upon the Warhammer world. Generally speaking, whenever Morslib is doing something interesting, like flashing or something like that, it is considered an astrological sign of great import. And since it's the Chaos Moon flashing in the sky, these events of great import are almost always extremely catastrophic, devastating, horrible, and destructive. Basically, it's the kind of shit that nobody actually wants to happen. In other words, it usually signals plot advancement. Tish. The theory is that Morslib was created in a way that attracts other Warpstone, which seems to be why it's all up there, since technically there should be a lot more Warpstone on the Warhammer planet in and of itself. There is even some speculation that it might have been a last-bid gambit by the Old Ones, or by their servants, the Slann, to basically try and suck all of the Warpstone off the planet and off into space. It clearly didn't quite work, because now there's a giant piece of Warpstone orbiting the planet ever so slowly, and I'm sure you all remember what I've been telling you about exposure to Warpstone at this point. Yeah, it's not a good thing. And occasionally, some of these pieces that were sent into the heavens will come back to play. The proverbial chicken returning to the roost. One of these occasions was, of course, the Meteor, the famous Sigmarite sign, a twin-tailed comet seen in the sky. Now, this was considered by practically all of the races of the Warhammer world to be a sign of some sort in relations to their religion, as is how religion and deities and ideologies usually function. If they can't explain something, it's usually up to the gods. The problem was that this particular meteorite was made out of Warpstone, and it was headed straight for the Warhammer world. In fact, it was by many considered to be a sign of ill omen, but not in the Empire. In fact, it in the Empire was described as the sign of Sigmar, the twin-tailed comet, and it was to arrive in the city of Mordheim. And yes, quite a few of you know what comes next. Millions of faithful flocked to the city of Mordheim, as the clergymen and the preachers all announced that this was Sigmar returned. He would descend from the heavens and bless his people. What actually descended from the heavens was a massive chunk of Warpstone that broke up in the lower atmosphere and shotgunned the entire city of Mordheim with massive clusters of solid Warpstone. The effect was predictable. The city itself was, of course, reduced to ruins. The population that was in the city were almost all killed for obvious reasons, and the few who did not die were turned into new and interesting life forms that roamed the streets of Mordheim, feasting upon any survivor with less mutations than they had. And of course, having been showered in the debris from a Warpstone meteorite, the city was now covered in the stuff, mutating the very city itself. The walls came to life. People that were in the city were fused with the street, the pavements, questing tentacles waving happily from windowsills, and random street corners baying and braying into the night. In Mordheim, the supernatural has most definitively become the natural and the mundane. And of course, it being located within the borders of the Empire, Mordheim became one of the primary sources of Warpstone, or Verbstone, throughout the civilized world, as there were massive amounts of it, and it was in a relatively safe area. Safe as in comparison to the Chaos Wastes, or Nagash's own personal mountain, or the depths of Skavendom, stuff like that. Obviously, the city is considered under quarantine and is heavily guarded, but money is a very, very, very good motivating factor, and considering the fact that even the merest sliver of Warpstone can be sold for considerable quantities, there is absolutely no shortage of warbands entering into the city of Mordheim to fight one another and claim as much Warpstone as possible, while also dealing with the various interesting inhabitants of that cursed city. And until it is finally picked completely clean of Warpstone, it will continue to suffer from its effect. And hell, even when it has been picked entirely clean, the entire place is probably going to have to be leveled with the ground and then rebuilt. And even then, well, the Kislevits tried that with Prague, and the buildings are still whispering at them. So, yeah. Because, of course, unlike more cuddly substances like nuclear radiation, for example, which actually has a half-life, the Warpstone never loses its potency, because magic. And now you know all you need to know about the glorious, the fantastic substance, the favoured form of lovely magical manipulation of the fluffy Skaven under Empire. And that, frankly, is the only thing that matters. Warpstone is awesome because the Skaven says it is. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.